Hi, welcome back to Detective and Mystery Fiction. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm notices me. This collection features 3 short stories from the January 1920 issue of Sim Street Smith's Detective Story magazine. The magazine was sold for 15 cents and contained 180 pages. I have added timestamps for each story. Hope you enjoy this one. Prohibition Helps Sometimes, by William Tillinghast Eldridge, author of The Bath Trap. Detective Story Magazine, January 6, 1920. If you had asked a dozen of the best plainclothes men on the Pacific coast if they knew Mr. John Barton, they would have shaken their heads. If you had asked them if they knew Cligg Faulkner, they would have nodded and added, undoubtedly, that they wished they knew he was behind bars. Yet John Barton and Cligg Faulkner were the same individual. The reason Faulkner was not behind bars was because the police had never been able to get him with the goods. They believed that he needed to serve time for a good many of the smoothest jewelry thefts that had ever been pulled, and finally laid away in the unsolved category. He was a thorn in the side of the police, but a thorn they had never been able to pluck. The reasons for this state of affairs were many. In the first place, Cligg Faulkner was a gentleman. That is, he looked, acted, spoke, dressed, and had been born a gentleman. What had turned him from pursuits common to gentlemen, none knew. He sat up nights, it seemed, devising ways to bother the police and enrich himself. His brain must have been fertile. Certainly, his ways were bold and daring. He pulled stunts another crook would never have attempted, and he usually worked alone, although now and then Silk Gregg, another thorn in the side of the police, ran with him. As John Barton, Faulkner had met a rich New Yorker on the Pacific coast. He had done this New Yorker a good turn, one gentleman to another, and they had become rather friendly during Mr. H. Raymond Van Seven's stay in the West. When they parted, Van Seven had urged Barton, the name by which he knew Faulkner, to drop in on him the next time he was in New York. This perhaps had a lot to do with Faulkner's decision to try out New York. Undoubtedly, he felt Van Seven's acquaintance would be a valuable acquisition. And so it proved, but not in exactly the way Faulkner expected. Another thing, the police were watching Faulkner more closely than ever, hoping to get him right. It was a period in Faulkner's life when a change of climate seemed advisable, new fields of labor, and that sort of thing. So he went east with his Japanese servant and looked New York over, first from the windows of the suite he selected in the Ritmore, where he was made comfortable by a very particular management. Later, he looked New York over from other angles, and establishing his identity as a wealthy Californian in several quarters, proceeded to think about making hay while the sun shone. On a beautiful afternoon when Fifth Avenue was alive with pedestrians, motor cars, and buses, he entered one of the largest jewelry stores upon that justly famous thoroughfare. Faulkner had made purchases in this store prior to this day, that part of his methods, and now, when he asked to examine unset diamonds, he was accorded the personal attention of the manager. In a small booth, a clerk presented for his inspection a number of large stones upon black velvet. Faulkner, dressed in the height of fashion, looking the part he played, lounged in the chair before the table upon which the stones were displayed. He didn't know, but he supposed that he was under the observation of other eyes than the clerk's. Undoubtedly, there was an observation hole somewhere in the walls, with a pair of sharp eyes glued thereto. That thought did not bother him in the least. The smoke from his Turkish cigarette curled about his head as he idly tapped his boot with his stick. The stones were laid out, arranged, and a setting suggested, but Faulkner did not grow enthusiastic. If they were made into a pendant, suggested the clerk. That's so, said Faulkner, coming into sudden action. Like this, eh? He moved the stones deftly one below the other as they hung, 3 superb diamonds when suspended on a platinum chain. He had bent over the table in doing this and palmed a diamond, seeming to do no more than touch them with the tips of his fingers, substituted an exceedingly clever imitation in place of the one lifted, and settled back with a considerate frown on his aristocratic face. He had, of course, specified the size of the stones he desired to see, so the false stone matched, to all appearances, the other 2 beside which it lay. "Well, yes," he said, yawning and narrowing his eyes as if to visualize the stones when set. "That might do. Suppose you have a design drawn, those 3 stones like that. In fact, lay them aside, those 3 particular ones. I really like them. I'll drop in a day or 2 and look at the sketch." He arose languidly, flicked the ashes from his waistcoat, and, being careful that neither of his hands went near his pockets, walked out of the booth. As he left, action followed. As perfect as Faulkner's lift had been, he was suspected. The 3 stones were hastily examined under a magnifying glass. "Quick!" snapped the manager who had been summoned. "Have that one tested. Quick!" He moved to intercept Faulkner and hold him in conversation, but he was too late. Faulkner was going out the main entrance. The store detective was given the sign and went quickly but not too hurriedly after Faulkner. As the store detective stepped to the sidewalk, he saw a headquarters man whom he knew. He made a quick sign and the plain-clothes man swung to his side. A mere nod from the store detective indicated the object of his interest. "Sure?" asked the plain-clothes man, looking Faulkner over quickly, and appraising him as anything but a crook if appearances were to be considered. "Only got the sign to follow him," the store detective shot out of one corner of his mouth. Faulkner had halted at the curb and was gazing idly about as if undecided which way to turn. The 2 detectives took a sudden interest in the nearest shop window. A man came out of the store and brushed past the 2. "Beg pardon," he apologized, and then, his voice lowering, "Get him. 3-carat white diamond on him. Just invite him back into the store," advised the plain-clothes man. "Don't want any fuss here." "Best way, sure," agreed the store detective. As he started to move forward, his companion at his side, both men stopped abruptly, for another man had come up behind Faulkner and clapped him on the shoulder. Faulkner came within an ace of letting the still-palmed diamond slip to the gutter. The next second he was shaking hands with the man who had thumped him on the back. "Well, of all the luck!" he exclaimed, and he meant it too, for out of the corner of his eye he had noted what was going on. "Was going to look you up. Only got in a few days ago. How are you?" "Never better. You're a sight for sore eyes." The 2 detectives, with astonishment written upon their faces, drew aside. "Say," whispered the plain-clothes man, "there must be some mistake here. That's Van Seven, the millionaire, the big society bug. He's a friend of that guy you are thinking's a crook. It's Van Seven, all right, and they're friends." Van Seven spoke to him. "Sure. No stall in this for our benefit. You're wrong somewhere. Beat it back into the store and put your boss wise. I'm not going to pull a friend of Van Seven's without more than you've got." The store detective hurried across the pavement. The manager was standing by the main entrance, looking out. "Headquarters man watching," he said, lowering his voice. "That's Mr. Van Seven he's talking with." "So I see," snapped the manager, very much troubled. Despite the fact that he knew a valuable stone had been stolen, he hesitated to make a move that might place him in a very embarrassing position. Unless he could prove the theft had been committed by Mr. Barton, the name by which Faulkner was known to him. The situation had become decidedly delicate. And he knew it. To accuse Faulkner of the crime placed him not only in danger of losing that gentleman's patronage, but also Mr. Van Seven's, and the latter's trade was something he had no wish to lose. At the same time, he was almost certain Faulkner was guilty. The chance that the imitation stone might have been substituted for the real diamond by someone else before the stones had been shown by Faulkner occurred to him. but he put it aside as impossible. He was in a quandary. Keep him under your eyes. He won't pass that stone to Mr. Van Seven, that's certain. See that he doesn't pass it to anyone else. Then, well, the minute he is alone, try and get him to come back here and see me. Tell him I want to see him about that design, he ordered. Quick! The last came as Mr. Van Seven and Faulkner turned up the avenue. The store detective rejoined the headquarters man, and up the avenue went the four, a little apart, the two in the lead chatting, the two following watchful. The store detective had conveyed his instructions to his companion. Your boss is off, persisted the plainclothes man, but I'll go on it a bit further. Van Seven had indicated the entrance to one of his clubs, and the two went up the steps. Faulkner shot a glance over his shoulder and picked out the two detectives whom he realized were following him, for he had not missed a move since he had lifted the stone. Let's have a drink, Van Seven suggested. Still wide open? Asked Faulkner, laughing. The bar's running the same as ever, but of course each member has his own private stock, name on your bottle. Rotten, isn't it? But then I guess there is pretty near enough down with my tag on it to last me out. I'm not worrying. The two passed to the bar, and Faulkner called for scotch. They stood talking as they had a second drink. Faulkner caught a glimpse of the two detectives at the far end of the room. Even the fortunate meeting with Van Seven hadn't shaken them, nor had the entry into the Millionaires' Club. They must be pretty certain. Somehow his fingers couldn't have moved quickly enough. He knew that as long as he was with Van Seven, the two bulls would hold off. After that, well, he believed he would have to face it, for they never would have followed him this far unless they meant business. He turned, idly twisting the bottle of scotch about. As he did so, listening to Van Seven's light talk, his eyes met those of the club attendant behind the bar. For a second he came near a start, for this man was someone whom he knew, at least someone whom he had seen before, although at the moment he couldn't place him. The club attendant had turned away without the slightest trace of recognition on his face. Faulkner decided he must have been mistaken. Slowly Faulkner drew the bottle of scotch toward him and picked it up with his left hand. I like that blend, he remarked, nodding at the bottle. Do you? I'll send 6 bottles up to your hotel. Don't think of it. I'm not as badly off as all that, wouldn't rob you. But I tell you what, as Van Seven would have protested, I'll take this one along with me. Why, it's half empty, said Van Seven with a laugh. We'll finish it, and then you can lug a fresh one. Faulkner shook his head. 2 is my limit. I'm not one to go this stuff heavily. No, let me have this bottle. Sentiment, that's all. This is the bottle out of which we had our first drink together in New York. I'm going to take it along and preserve it. You know our meeting on the coast was a lucky one. Lucky for me. You saved me from that bunch of grafters. I'd have fallen for that slick crowd if you hadn't stepped in. Faulkner nodded and laughed. There never had been any occasion for him to explain to Van Seven that he had tipped him off because he had a grudge against the men who had attempted to fleece the wealthy New Yorker. Well, he said, that meeting was lucky then for you. This one is lucky for me, found an old friend. I'll carry this bottle away to make the luck hold. Van Seven shrugged. He considered it rather odd, but he didn't choose to argue with a guest. Drive a cork into that and wrap it up, he ordered. I'll take it along with me, said Faulkner. Very good, sir, agreed the club servant, and slipping a cork into the bottle, he stepped through the swinging doors. The two men stood talking until the package was brought to them. Where now? Asked Van Seven, glancing at his watch. Down street. An errand or two. I've got an engagement. Call you tomorrow. Right, agreed Faulkner. You don't want to carry that package with you, insisted Van Seven, and taking the bundle, he wrote Faulkner's name and address upon it. He turned it in at the desk, ordering that it be sent along at once. The two men passed to the sidewalk, parted, and Faulkner, to the amazement of the two detectives, went back along the avenue and into the jewelry store where he was very much wanted. He went directly to a counter, purchased a gold match safe, ordered it engraved, and paid for his purchase. As he turned away from the counter, the manager faced him. "Can I trouble you just a minute?" came the request. He had received the report of his detective, and while he still held grave doubts, he didn't feel he should allow the incident to pass without taking some action. In view of what he had been told of Faulkner's movements, he didn't see how the man could have gotten rid of the stone. The two went into the manager's office, and the situation was placed before Faulkner plainly and frankly. He heard the manager through. "Where," he said in an even tone, "do you search people whom you suspect of theft?" The manager knew then that he had lost the stone, or that Faulkner believed he had some place of concealment on his person that couldn't be found. He was almost tempted to try and pass the thing off as a joke, but Faulkner gave him no time to say a word. He demanded to be searched at once. When he came out from the ordeal, and it had been a thorough one, he was far cooler than the manager. "I just purchased a matchbox, and it was to be engraved. It slipped my mind when I was in looking at the diamonds, and I had to come back for it," he said, looking over the manager's head as if no one was within 100 yards of him. "Will you kindly get me my money and have the order cancelled?" The manager strove to protest. He offered profound apologies, and Faulkner allowed him to have his say. When he had quite done, Faulkner looked at him once. "I'm waiting for my money," he suggested. The money was brought to him. He shoved the bills into his waistcoat pocket and walked out of the store the coolest of all, familiar with the incident. "And he never mentioned Van Seven's name," groaned the manager, mopping his brow. "I certainly made it wrong that time." Faulkner returned to his hotel and found the package from Van Seven's club in his rooms. He locked the hall door, had his Jap servant bring him a pitcher, and undid the package. Drawing the cork, he carefully decanted the whiskey, allowing the last drop to trickle very slowly from the mouth of the bottle. He looked into the bottle, frowned, turned the bottle upside down, and finally shook it. Then he set the bottle down and slowly poured the liquor from the pitcher back into it. He looked into the pitcher. Faulkner's frown grew. He was thinking hard. He picked up the bottle. It bore Van Seven's name. It also had a piece torn from the label where he had allowed his fingernail to scratch the surface as an additional identification. Faulkner walked to the window and looked down on New York. His first little flyer had been taken, and he was beaten. Was he losing his cunning? Suddenly he swung about. Taking his hat and stick, he went out and down the avenue to H. Raymond Van Seven's club. Inquiries there secured for him an address, and he hailed a taxi. When the cab stopped, he found himself before a rooming house on the east side. Further inquiries led him to a room on the 3rd floor. He knocked. The door was opened, and he stepped inside. "Remember me?" he asked genially. The man who faced him shook his head. "Oh, but you do, and now I remember you. I didn't think you recognized me any more than I did you when you served Mr. Van Seven and myself. How long have you been in New York?" "I'm afraid, sir, that you have made a mistake," said the broad-shouldered man, the club servant who had served Van Seven and Faulkner, and later wrapped up the bottle of whiskey. Faulkner smiled. "Not at all. You were known as Frank Clemens on the Pacific Coast, and you were a dealer at one time in Mooney's gambling club. I get you now. Listen, you recognized me. You saw those two bulls watching me, and your quick brain started asking, why? Then you took a quick drop. You knew what my lay was on the coast, and you fancied I'd be on the same line here. You had your eye on me, and when I insisted on that particular bottle of whiskey, you fell. You went out to wrap it up. What did you do?" The man facing him had not moved a muscle. His features were stolid. "I still don't understand," he said. Faulkner laughed again. He knew when he was beaten. He might denounce this man at the club, and he'd lose his place. In return, this fellow could tip off the New York police. "Well, friend," said Faulkner, "you'd seen me fingering that bottle. You poured out the whiskey, pocketed the diamond, and refilled the bottle. Clever thinking. I hand it to you." He gave a nod, walked to the door, put his hand on the knob, and looked back. He was a sport. No malice showed on his face. "Prohibition helps some sometimes, doesn't it?" he said as he opened the door. When the door closed, the club servant allowed his face to relax. He smiled. End of Prohibition Helps, sometimes, by William Tillinghast Eldridge. Vengeance is Mine. A True Story. By Ernest M. Pote, author of Reinforced Defense. Detective Story Magazine, January 13th, 1920. I have practiced medicine for more years than I care to remember, and most of my time has been spent in treating the insane. I have been the repository of countless secrets. 1,000 family closets have opened to me, revealing skeletons grim and grisly. I am old in the painfully acquired wisdom of the psychiatrist, who must grub at the roots of life, who, above all other men, knows what the great teacher meant when he spoke of whited sepulchres, fair without, but within full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. Long ago I passed through cynicism to tolerance, learning that though roses may grow from a muck heap, their blooms are no less sweet. One by one, my illusions have withered and died, each leaving me a little sadder, a little grayer, a little more lenient toward the faults of others as I learned my own frailties. It is long since I lost faith in my power to judge, for I have seen good grow out of evil, and evil come to good. But one thing I believe, and the passing years have forced it in upon me over and over, until I know that it is the bottom ground of human life. Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. That man who transgresses the laws of life, cry he never so loudly upon a pitying God, must yet pay for his sins. I have been young, and now am old. Many a man have I watched as he sowed the wind, and have lived to see him reaping the whirlwind in bitterness and tears. But this is not a tract. I am the last man to preach a sermon. Let me only point my moral with this true tale. I never knew the man's name. I may have heard it once, but it went from me. Yet I remember him well, as vividly as though he stood before me now. It was 2 years ago that I saw him first. I had been in Syracuse giving expert testimony at a murder trial. It was 2 o'clock of a clear, cold January morning when I reached again my house in New York. I climbed the steps slowly, rubbing cinder-reddened eyes. I had walked from the Grand Central Station, only a few blocks away, but now I regretted it. I grow too old for exercise and also for late hours. I yearned for my wide, comfortable bed, and it was with distinct annoyance that I discovered a man standing in the vestibule. I swung my black bag prominently forward, not knowing his intent. Long since, I learned what a potent talisman is that little square medicine case, that footpad is hardened indeed who will attack a physician on his rounds. His profession protects him, for no man, honest or not, knows when he may need a doctor's care. But his first words undeceived me. "Are you the doctor?" he asked. There was an odd, slurring hurry in his voice. He was breathing deeply. I just cut myself a bit. He was well hidden in the dark vestibule, but even so he drew back a little, glancing apprehensively over my shoulder as though he feared pursuit. My own practice is limited to nervous and mental diseases, but mine is the only doctor's office on the street from Lexington Avenue to 6th Avenue, and so an occasional emergency call comes to me. Groaning inwardly, I unlocked the door and stood aside. My unknown visitor entered, stumbling over the threshold, and I followed him. I brought him into the office and turned on the lights. He was a big, broad-shouldered, florid man of the over-tailored, valeted, massaged, manicured type, such as one sees in Turkish baths, one of those men who look all muscle but are all unhealthy fat, who are always drinking and never drunk, who have delirium tremens if they break a limb, and at last die in a day from pneumonia, or in a month from Bright's disease, a man about town, as the word goes. His dress was in disorder, his collar unfastened, his well-cut coat was open to the cold, and his shirt was blood-stained over the chest. At first glance I thought him drunk, but a closer look corrected that impression. Yet he was evidently much excited. His hands trembled. He spoke thickly, fumbling with his shirt buttons. "I just cut myself with a knife," said he. I had to help him open his shirt. In his left breast was a shallow gash, perhaps 3 inches long. It gaped widely, showing an inch of yellow fat beneath the skin. The man bled freely. The cut slanted up and outward. How he could have wounded himself so, I could not understand. As I cleaned the cut, I looked him over more carefully, wondering. His face was broad and red, set in jovial lines, and under his eyes were the puffy traces of beginning Bright's disease. His left eyelid drooped a little, giving him an air half jocular, half sinister. His small, hard eyes seemed mismated. When I tilted the shade of my lamp so that the light shone full in his face, I could see that his right pupil was twice as large as the left, and that neither iris contracted in the glare. The man was manifestly in haste. As I strapped the cut together with adhesive plaster, he threw a bill on the table and hurried out with a muttered word of thanks, buttoning his coat around him. I followed him out and stood in the doorway a moment, watching his retreating figure, clearly outlined in the moonlight. He walked swiftly but with a swaying, shuffling gait. His feet squeaked in the crisp snow. When he had reached the corner of Fifth Avenue, I turned to go in, meditating upon that piper who exacts pay for every dance. But the sound of hurried, irregular footbeats arrested me. I looked westward. From the farther end of the block came another man, at an awkward, shambling run, a frail, bearded man. Seeing me, he shouted thickly and came plunging up the steps. Then he stood voiceless for a moment, mouthing breathlessly, his thin, bearded face all twitching and wild under the pale moon. One eye was swollen shut. "Is he here?" he gasped, shaking my arm roughly. "Bring him out. Big beefy slob." Between each word he gulped upon a sob. He seemed beside himself with rage and pain and fear. He would take it from me. No? Well, he would buy another. He knew a pawnbroker who would sell him one, and so on. At last, I lost patience with him. "Let the man live," said I. "Is there no hand above your hand? It is God who curses and no other. Do you pay your own debts, and so shall he, as I must, and all of us. Some day you may find that it would have been mercy and not punishment to kill him now." And this I said from sure knowledge, for the florid man's stumbling speech, his drooping eyelid, and unequal pupils had told me a tale. Perhaps the little clerk read this knowledge in my voice. At least the words calmed him. And so he went out, stoop-shouldered and submissive as the drugs died in him, brushing a hand bewilderedly across his eyes, and I saw him no more. Afterward, I went my ways and thought no more of this matter, being inured to strange experiences. But as you will see, the despoiler of the weak clerk was not forgotten by the Supreme Judge. For about 6 months later, I was called in consultation upon a case of nervous prostration. My worthy colleague was one of those staid practitioners who diagnose 2 forms of mental disease, hysteria and nervous prostration, with an exception in favor of occasional delirium tremens. So that I was not overly impressed by his opinion. We drove to an apartment house on Riverside Drive, he talking ponderously all the way. It was one of those huge, ornate houses with over-decorated lobbies and over-uniformed Jamaican hallboys, which are inhabited chiefly by stockbrokers and promoters, and by the newly rich adventurers from inland cities, whose tenants are overdressed and underbred, whose very atmosphere smells of money not over clean. Our patient's brother was waiting for us in the lobby. I have forgotten his name. "A very sad case, doctor," he confided. "Henry has changed so in the last few months. He was a good businessman, perhaps a little too fond of a good time, a promoter. You know how they are. He specialized in gold mining stocks. A splendid businessman, always within the law. Never any questions from the post office inspectors even. But lately he's been careless. His last promotion, Nevada Mother Lode he called it, well, it was pretty raw. And he's getting so forgetful, can't remember anything, makes foolish, unnecessary promises to his clients. Some of them are acting up ugly already. And last week he began burning his money up, throwing it into the streets. Said he was made of money, had golden automobiles and all that." He laughed nervously. "And he has all sorts of delusions, and sometimes he's even violent." He passed an unsteady hand over one cheek, and I saw a raw bruise there. I found the patient sitting on his bed, half-dressed. He was unshaven and tousled, but I knew him at once. His left eyelid had dropped down over the eye like a window curtain close drawn. His florid face was flushed, his mouth crooked and drawn to one side. He rose unsteadily to greet me, stumbled, and almost fell, but caught my arm. "Why, it's the old doc," he cried boisterously. "Same old doc, whiskers and all. Good old scout doc here, fix me up, he did long time go. Fix me right, see scar." And he began fumbling at his collarless shirt. "Friends for life, me and doc," he rambled on. He talked as though his mouth were full, slurring and stumbling over words. "He hid me, saved my life like as not. Nevmin doc, old scout." He patted my arm clumsily. "I don't forget. I got money now. $100 million, $100,000 million. Give the old doc some, hey? Going to build a Hosh hospital, good old hospital. Make the old doc boss." He laughed emptily, sputteringly, and slapped his leg, almost falling. Then his mood changed. He glanced apprehensively over his shoulder. "I ain't safe," he cried. "They're going to kill me, got it all planned, want my money." He began quite suddenly and childishly to weep. He sobbed openly, wiping a sodden, tear-dabbled face upon his sleeve. His nurses drew unostentatiously closer. "He gets violent sometimes, doctor," explained one. "The other day, I went to a certain licensed house for the insane. It is like half a dozen others in Westchester and out on Long Island, luxurious, expensive sanatoria, maintained for people so wealthy that they never need to go crazy like ordinary folk, but merely suffer a complete nervous breakdown which demands prolonged rest and the complete abandonment of their social duties. As I walked through the spacious halls with the resident physician, I chanced to look into an open door and saw my florid friend for the last time, reaping the crop that he had sown. He was hopelessly bedridden, his knees stiff, drawn up by contractures. He lay on his back, head raised and thrust forward like a turtle's, and ground his teeth interminably. They'd been worn down by constant friction, almost to the gums. His face was flat and flabby, all expressions sponged away. The gritting of his teeth sounded in the quiet room like a stupid child's lead pencil squeaking hopelessly through a stubborn sum. I spoke to him, but he did not know me. He only blinked and mumbled inarticulately, then broke forth into a horrid, monotonous, tearless wailing. "An advanced paretic, one of our worst cases," said my guide. Today, I heard that he had paid his last debt to the piper. It brought him to my mind, and so I have used his story to point my moral. Not a pleasing tale, perhaps, but only too common. My old heart is heavy with the weight of many such. End of Vengeance is Mine by Ernest Impote. 12 Great Detectives. by Charles Kingston. Detective Story Magazine, January 6, 1920. Frank Froest, MVO. When the history of Scotland Yard is written, and the historian has to name the famous men who have built up its worldwide fame, Frank Froest must be one of his first choices. No one has done more than he has to make the detective force efficient and successful, and to gain for it the confidence, goodwill, and admiration of the general public. He was not the detective who sees crime in everything and everybody, though when it was established beyond dispute that there was a wrong to avenge on behalf of the law, Froest was as relentless in the pursuit as anyone. A case may be quoted here as typical of him. One day, the dead body of a fully clothed man was discovered head downward in a water butt at the back of a house in a London suburb, and when it was examined, a severe cut on the forehead was revealed. Here was the material for a first-class romance, with plenty of scope for a clever detective to prove his ability. Frank Froest was sent for, and all concerned were prepared for a sensation. But the detective instantly brought his common sense to bear upon the matter. "This is simple enough," he said quietly. "The man was not murdered. He hurt his head by accident, and came to this water butt to wash the wound. In leaning over the barrel, he overbalanced and fell in, and being unable to free his arms, was drowned. That's the explanation." But there was at least one in his audience who hotly disputed the solution. "That's impossible, Mr. Froest," he said warmly. "No man could have fallen in like that or failed to extricate himself from the position you described. Now, I'll proceed to wash my forehead in the water butt, and you'll see I'll have little difficulty in doing so without the slightest danger of overbalancing myself. That man was murdered." Without further argument, he leaned over the butt to reach the water, and the next moment his heels were in the air. If the experimenter had not been hauled out promptly, he would have been drowned. That was the end of the water butt mystery. Mr. Froest is a happy combination of good humor and strength. That his benevolent features do not belie him is proved by a popularity born of kindness to friend and foe alike. Many an old lag has appealed to him for help, and seldom in vain, for there is nothing of the stiff official about him, and he can sympathize with and appreciate the difficulties of those who have gone under. A stranger meeting Frank Froest would decide that the broad-shouldered, happy-looking and prosperous middle-aged gentleman was a successful business or professional man, anything in fact, except a detective. 34 years of active service at Scotland Yard failed to kill his belief in human nature. If we take into consideration the millions of money involved, there can be no doubt of the fact that the biggest case Froest was ever engaged upon was that known as the Liberator frauds. He took a leading part in unraveling the intricate swindles promoted by Jabez Balfour, who died with tragic suddenness in the early part of 1916, Hobbs, the builder, and Wright, the solicitor. Thousands of unfortunate persons subscribed money to the bogus building society and its offshoots, and for a time the principals enjoyed all the advantages of vast wealth. The victims were dosed with dividends paid out of their capital, and false balance sheets, revealing manufactured profits, lulled them to sleep. Jabez Balfour was the most popular citizen of Croydon, and when that town became entitled to have its own mayor, Balfour was the first choice. From the mayor's chair, he stepped into Parliament, becoming a candidate for a place in the government and offering to subscribe £50,000 to the party funds if he was created a baronet. The cheque was actually sent, but on the initiative of the late Lord Salisbury, it was returned, and only in time, for shortly afterward, the bubble burst. Hobbs and Wright were arrested, and Balfour fled to South America, leaving behind him thousands of ruined, broken, and despairing families. Some of his victims committed suicide, others went mad. The Liberator Building Society was a cruel fraud on the thriftiest portion of England's population. Among the numerous officers engaged on the case, Froest stood out as the most successful, and when Jabez Balfour was located in the Argentine Republic, the detective was sent to bring him back. Balfour, however, fought tooth and nail against extradition, and for a while, the Argentine government was on his side. The swindler bought a brewery and settled down to work it. He was an indulgent employer, and he had no hesitation in giving away some of the money he had stolen from his victims. All this enhanced his popularity, and the Argentinos were easily persuaded that Jabez Balfour, the one-time member of the great British Parliament, was not a thief at all, and had only fled from the political tyranny of the English to the freedom-loving Argentinos. For 2 years, the battle between Froest and the Republic dragged on. Occasionally, the detective gained the advantage, and Balfour was arrested and lodged in jail. With the aid of a medical certificate or an influential friend, he secured his release. An ordinary man would have abandoned the chase or have displayed a disgust with it that would have endangered ultimate success. Froest, however, was determined to bring the great swindler back to England, and eventually, the day came when perseverance was rewarded, and Jabez Balfour was handed over to him. He had won. Froest took his prisoner aboard a steamer, confident that his troubles were at last at an end. In this he was mistaken, for just as the boat was about to leave, 2 officials of the Argentine High Court came on board with an order signed by the Chief Justice for Balfour's release. This placed the detective in an awkward fix, but not for long. He appealed to the British minister, and a guard was put on board the steamer to prevent further interference until it was ready to sail. Of course, the detective, during his protracted stay in South America, had many exciting and amusing adventures. Among the latter was the stoking of an engine. It came about in this manner when Jabez Balfour's extradition had been granted by the government and he was in Froest's keeping. A long railway journey was necessary to convey him to the port of embarkation. Now, Balfour's popularity was so great that no one in the town where he had lived would consent to stoke the engine of the train which was to take him from their midst. The driver was all right, but he must have a stoker or the train would not start. Froest solved the difficulty by taking on the job. The work was not hard to a man who can tear a pack of cards in two. Balfour was ultimately convicted at the Old Bailey and sentenced to 14 years penal servitude. At the Ascot races of 1912, King George was told that Superintendent Frank Froest was about to retire. Instantly the king sent for him, and at the end of a cordial conversation, His Majesty spoke these words, "Goodbye, Mr. Froest, and Godspeed. The detective and police organization in which you have served is the best in the world." It was a kindly and just tribute to the great detective, and perhaps as he was speaking, His Majesty was thinking of that memorable and tragic day in Madrid when King Alfonso married Princess Ina of Battenberg. King George was then Prince of Wales, and with the princess, he was present at the ceremony as the representative of the British royal family. It was known that a score of dangerous anarchists had flocked to Spain to reinforce the native terrorists, and the British Political Detective Department was highly nervous for the safety of the Prince of Wales. Froest was accordingly commissioned to watch over the heir to the throne and his wife, and an arduous time he had too. He had to shadow them day and night, and yet never appear obtrusive. It will be remembered that a bomb was hurled at the bride and bridegroom. It actually fell within a few yards of the famous detective and killed 23 and injured 99 persons. It was for his royal charge, and not for his own safety, that he felt most anxious, and he must have been greatly relieved when the prince and princess were able to return home. That was a period of intense activity in anarchist circles, an activity which bore fruit less than 2 years later, when King Carlos of Portugal and his eldest son were assassinated. We all know how brief was the reign of King Carlos's second son. He escaped death by flight to England. There is no man who likes living better than Frank Froest, and he ought to know, because he has been near death himself more than once. But he has never worried. It is not his nature to do so. Strong men are nearly always generous and tolerant. Froest is one of them. Besides, if he had worried, he would not have lasted 34 years in the service. He did his duty fearlessly and never took advantage of his position. In the circumstances, only a madman could conceive a violent hatred of him. He's had many narrow escapes. The notorious American train thief, O'Brien, provided him with one. O'Brien was wanted in America for the theft of $30,000, and he thought a holiday in England would benefit his health. Froest was deputed to arrest him, having been warned that the American crook was a gunman as well. The detective haunted the neighborhood of the West End hotels and restaurants, and he was rewarded one afternoon when he came face to face with O'Brien outside a restaurant in the vicinity of Piccadilly. Without waiting to introduce himself, Froest tackled his man, and before the surprised scoundrel could realize what had happened, he was not only a prisoner, but his cherished revolver was safely deposited in the detective's pocket. O'Brien was extradited and taken to America, where he was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. He had, however, sworn that he would avenge himself on Froest, and he did not intend to wait 10 years. Shortly after his trial, he escaped, and his first act on regaining his freedom was to book passage to Europe. Within a surprisingly short space of time, he was back again in London, with a most formidable assortment of weapons intended to convince Frank Froest that he was a person who must not be interfered with. Great was O'Brien's joy when he saw the English detective walking down Regent Street. He concealed himself in a doorway, with his revolver ready in his hand, but, as it happened, the detective paused to light a cigar, and then, instead of proceeding straight on, crossed the road and mingled with the crowd. He had no idea how near he was to death. Had he passed the doorway in which O'Brien stood, he would assuredly have been murdered, and it was only by the merest chance that he altered his course. His original intention had been to stroll the length of the street, and why he changed his mind, he never could tell. After this incident, O'Brien seems to have lost his nerve. No doubt he realized that the detective who had captured him once would do so again. He left the country and returned to America, and later was sentenced to imprisonment for life for a cold-blooded murder. O'Brien died in prison. The Liverpool bank frauds is another case that occupies considerable space in the detective's notebook. It began in the autumn of 1901, when a clerk by the name Gowdy in the Bank of Liverpool casually mentioned to a colleague that he was going out for a few minutes. "I'll be back presently," he said, and to prove it, he did not trouble to take his hat off its peg. Gowdy did not come back, and the bank's auditor discovered that the clerk had stolen £170,000 from the account of Mr. Hudson, a soap manufacturer. For a few weeks, the clerk evaded arrest, but his hatless condition provided a clue that the police found of great value. He was located in a lodging house in Bootle and captured, but meanwhile, a London end to the story of gullibility and fraud had been discovered. Gowdy had stolen the money to make a splurge on the turf. Certain bookmakers and their kind, aided by several racecourse sharps, had joined together to make use of their poor dupe. One day it was rumoured in a quarter in London, where bookmakers congregate, that there was a Liverpool bank clerk who was betting in thousands of pounds. "We must have a share of this," said the bookmakers, and they all journeyed to Liverpool, interviewed the wretched thief, and plainly told him that he must go on betting if he did not wish to be exposed. They offered to put as much as £30,000 on a single race for him, an impossible stake, as the veriest racecourse tyro ought to know, but apparently Gowdy did not. No honest bookmaker would accept such a sum because, if the horse won, it would mean ruin for the layer. He could not possibly pay such odds as 33 to 1 on a bet of £30,000. But Gowdy believed all that he was told and handed over the money. Of course, the horse did not win, and the money was divided among the Confederates. Gowdy was advised to try his luck again. "One win, "And you'll get every penny back," said the tempters, and he fell again. But on this occasion, a miracle happened. The bank clerk wished to back a certain horse to win, and the stake he put up was £20,000. The bet was accepted, and arrangements were made for the animal not to win, but to the consternation of the conspirators, it actually came in first, and as the odds were 25-1, Gaudi was entitled to receive $500,000 of money. The Confederates, however, soon regained their equanimity. Tell him that his bet wasn't in time, or that one of our clerks failed to inform us about it. Any lie will do. Gaudi was not paid a penny, and the game was up. He dared not steal any more of the bank's money. Frank Froest was quickly on the trail of the London swindlers. He swept aside difficulties, resisted all attempts to put him on the wrong scent, and ignored hints, appeals, and bribes. One of the bookmakers caught a continental steamer. Froest had a man waiting for him on the other side of the channel, but the conspirator committed suicide by jumping into the sea. In London, all the others had been safely gathered into the net, and once again Frank Froest had triumphed. The sentences were severe, Gaudi being sent to prison for 10 years. Well might Mr. Justice Bigham, now Viscount Mersey, addressing Gaudi, say, "I do not know whether to marvel more at the folly of your wickedness or the wickedness of your folly." The clerk died in prison. It is doubtful if he was a criminal at heart, but there is no doubt that he was a fool. It was mainly due to Froest that the Bank of Liverpool recovered the greater portion of the stolen money. The detective ferreted out the various sources it had reached. It was not easy to achieve this, for the criminals, anticipating inquiries, had taken precautions to cover up the tracks of their plunder. It was distributed among various banks, English and foreign. It was concealed in the most out-of-the-way corners, and some of it was in the keeping of a music hall artiste who had not known its tainted origin. The detective went everywhere, and if findings had been keepings, he would have been entitled to a fortune. The robbery of the Townsend Burden jewels, valued at £25,000, was another mystery that Frank Froest cleared up. Jewel robberies run much on the same lines, and the person first suspected is generally the thief. In this case, however, there were more than ordinary difficulties. Froest realized that he was up against a jewel theft for which there were few precedents. He soon suspected that the thieves had received valuable aid from the inside, and he began to make inquiries about the servants. It was then that he altered his opinion. The burglary had been committed entirely from the inside and was not the work of professionals. Once he had established this fact, his task was light. Servants are, as a rule, most honest. If they stoop to theft, it is because they are tempted from the outside. In this particular instance, there were 2 dishonest servants, and they had managed the robbery on their own. Froest, having gathered the necessary evidence, arrested them, and they received 10 years penal servitude each for their crime. During the South African War, when Scotland Yard had a tremendous amount of political, as well as criminal work on hand, as it has today, a telegram was received from the police in South Africa containing the 3 words, "Watch Steamship Scott." That was all, and nothing was known at the yard as to why they should pay particular attention to the steamer in question. But evidently their South African colleagues needed assistance, and Frank Froest was sent down to Southampton with another detective to await the arrival of the steamship Scott. At the earliest possible moment, the 2 detectives went on board and had a look around. There was not much to go upon, as the telegram had not been supplemented by later and more detailed information. But Froest realized that there was at least one individual on that ship who ought to be arrested, and he resolved to get him. His attention had been attracted by a dark-visaged man who was wearing a wig, and he followed him about unobtrusively. The passenger had a brief interview with the purser, from whom he received a small package, and then proceeded to the gangway. He was about to step off the liner when Froest suddenly snatched the package out of his hand. The astounded traveler wheeled round on him in a fury. "Who are you?" he demanded hoarsely. "How dare you commit such an outrage? I will have you punished for this." "I am Detective Inspector Froest of Scotland Yard," said the officer with perfect good humor. "Here is my card. Perhaps now you realize that I am not acting without good reason." "I know nothing except that you are an insolent scoundrel," said the infuriated man, beside himself with rage. But Frank Froest's temper has never been easy to ruffle. "Come, come," he said genially. "I must know what is in this package." "They are diamonds," was the curt answer, "and they belong to me. Now hand them over and clear off." "I'm afraid I can't do that," said the detective calmly. "At any rate, not before I have made a few inquiries. I'd like to be convinced that they are actually your property, and so I intend to take them to Scotland Yard. If you wish to claim them, you must call there." "I insist upon being given my own property," said the passenger, making a last desperate effort. By now, the detective could see that his man was becoming uneasy. His eyes told their own story of fear. "Where is your receipt for them and your permit to take them out of South Africa?" said Froest. "Unless I can see those papers, the package goes to Scotland Yard." The traveler explained that the papers were in his baggage in the hold of the ship and would take considerable time to find. He swore that he would produce them later, but Froest was adamant. "You know my address," he said as they parted, and smiled again as the epithet scoundrel was flung at him. It was mostly conjecture, of course. There was actually no charge against the man from South Africa, but in the opinion of the detective, his appearance and manner were highly suspicious. With the South African War in progress, the political department at Scotland Yard had to deal with many strange persons and things. And there may have been an idea at the back of the detective's brain that the package of diamonds had something to do with the Boer Secret Service. The two detectives and the South African travelled by the same train to London, all three in different compartments. The other detective's duty was to shadow the new arrival, while Froest was to deliver the package at Scotland Yard and report. The train journey did not lessen the South African's sense of virtuous indignation. He went to a hotel and told the story of the outrage to the sympathetic manager, who listened attentively. "This is the scoundrel's card, sir," the traveller concluded, handing it to the hotel official. As soon as the latter read the name, he hastened to reassure the indignant guest. "Oh, Mr. Froest," he exclaimed. "He's all right. He'll treat you fairly. You couldn't be in the hands of a better man. Just you go to Scotland Yard and explain. Mr. Froest will give you back your package without any further delay. He's the fairest detective in the world. You'll like him when you know him." "I don't want to know him," said the South African with a scowl. "I want my diamonds, but I'll take your advice and call at Scotland Yard." A cab was procured, and the victim ordered the driver to take him to the headquarters of the detective service. The cab bowled along, and no doubt, the fare spent the time composing a few cutting phrases for the benefit of the blundering detective. But somehow the nearer the vehicle got to the yard, the less inclined the man felt to put his head into the lion's mouth. Scotland Yard bristles with dangers for the evildoer. There are so many astute officers there who have remarkable memories for faces that it is best to give them all the room you can afford if you have a guilty conscience. Indignation produced sufficient artificial courage for the South African to remain in the cab until it pulled up at the yard. Then it evaporated, and throwing a coin to the cabman, he bolted as if for his life. The diamonds remained unclaimed, and Frank Froest spent many days on the mystery. It resulted in the arrest of the man with the wig. He had declared that he wished to have nothing further to do with Mr. Froest, but they were destined to make a long voyage together. The South African authorities wanted the man on a charge of smuggling diamonds out of that country, and when his removal to South Africa was ordered. It was Froest who acted as his companion from port to port, and who gave evidence at his trial. The traveller was given a long sentence. A party of sailors went ashore, got intoxicated, and on their return became hilarious. They seized one of their number, not the most popular man among them, and playfully hauled him on board another vessel by means of a rope. When he was dragged on deck, it was found that the rope had slipped from his body and was tight around the sailor's neck. They laid him on the deck and tried to revive him, but he was dead, and the seaman responsible was arrested and charged with murder. The only hope he had was that the jury might bring in a verdict of manslaughter, as none of them had been sober at the time of their companion's death. Frank Froest inquired into the case on behalf of the police. He was not out for anyone's scalp, as many might have been. If he was convinced that murder had been committed, he would have shown the murderer no mercy, but, as usual, he went into the matter with an open mind. A comprehensive examination of the dead man's body led him to make a statement which must have sounded absurd. "I don't think that man was alive when the rope was placed around him," he said thoughtfully. "I have been told that after a lot of drink he began to eat biscuits. You will find that he was choked by them. The accused seaman tells me that when his companion dropped in the street, they thought he was only drunk, and when he refused to move an inch, they came to the conclusion that he was helplessly drunk. They carried him to the dock and there fastened the rope around him. Their idea was to put him on the wrong vessel and have him carried out to sea. It was just a practical joke," the detective added, "and none of them suspected that the object of it was already dead." Of course, the opinion of such an authority had to be treated seriously. It was just as well, for the post-mortem examination by the doctor confirmed Mr. Froest's theory in every respect, and the incarcerated seaman was immediately released from prison. In writing an account of ex-Superintendent Froest's career, the difficulty is not so much to find interesting cases he has been connected with as to know what to leave out. From the day he was appointed to succeed Superintendent Melville down to his retirement in November 1912, he was the guiding spirit in all the big criminal prosecutions. When he served under Superintendent Melville as a chief inspector, he was never idle. Thus, he was concerned in thousands of remarkable criminal cases. On his retirement, Mr. Froest gave up his home in London and retired to a well-known seaside resort. He was promptly made a magistrate, as he had nothing to do but improve his golf, and it was thought that the magisterial bench would not interfere too much with his game. He is still in the prime of life and retains much of his strength. During the Great War, the authorities were glad to avail themselves of his help and advice. But it is as the man who helped to make Scotland Yard famous, while he earned a great name for himself as a detective of originality and resource, that Frank C. Froest, MVO, JP, will go down to posterity. End of 12 Great Detectives by Charles Kingston.